All right. I'm glad I put on a clean shirt. That was just recorded. So that's a good sign for the funding and the grants. And it's hey Kevin. And so that's been some work and sort of work that I wasn't necessarily expecting to do, but I think it's been useful to sort of. It also gave me a good scope of like what's going on in the project too. And then I have been trying to help offload tasks from the development team, like running the weekly call, and then sort of trying to do some of the testing and things like that as well. Hey Kevin, just FYI, we're recording this. So if people want to go into more detail, I'm happy to go into more detail in those tasks. If anyone's ever curious on what's my what's on my to-do list or what's in progress, I sort of have been keeping this Trello board, which I think is open to the public. Let me know if you can access it. And so that list of the updates is basically just, I'm just sort of transferring that stuff and cleaning it up a little bit so a third party can understand it into the doc from the Trello board. But really, what I'm hoping for this time as well is just to sort of talk about not even as much as like what I've been working on, although I'm certainly happy to talk about that, but then also, what if I'm spending my time in the right way, and if not, like what could I be spending my time on that might be better use of my time? If there's anything anyone would want to offload to me, definitely. I'd hope that people could bring that up at any time, but this is a good, I think, way to just formally say, like, if you want to offload, especially for the developers, and actually you too, totally, because you've got a lot on your plate too. Whatever you want to offload to me, I'm happy to try to help out with that. With that, does anyone have any initial responses or things that come to mind?
Well, I guess there are a few things I'd be curious to discuss and hear other people's perspective. But maybe before we do that, I'm wondering if, like, as someone who joined the workflow and kind of the work that's been going on, do you have kind of like big picture comments for us about like what we should be paying attention to that we haven't, even just like systematic things that we're messing up or communication that's failing, and what we could improve on there. But then I'd love to talk about other things as well.
It's, I think some of it are just not surprising challenges with having a very distributed team, with a lot of it sort of, especially on the developer side, on a volunteer basis, so that people have like, other important work commitments. So, it's not, it's not like we're all sitting in the same room together, working on a project full time or something. So it's a very sort of different work environment. I think we're utilizing GitHub really well. And I think Slack is always a challenge too, just because it's sort of asynchronous and we're also dealing with multiple time zones. And so I'm still trying to figure out like the best way to utilize Slack, because we have archivers and we have, the edgy Slack, and then we have all these different channels. And so, it's just, my concern is always I'm going to miss something. And sometimes I get to something late, the notifications is, I don't know if it's just me and how I'm using my phone or the notifications I get on my desktop, but, sometimes I feel like I'm always afraid of missing something in Slack, because there's so much volume, or something gets threaded. And then I'm trying to think about like, what was that thing that someone said like 4 days ago? And I'm searching like in 5 different channels for something. People are smiling, so maybe they've had that experience before. And I don't know if there's a solution to that necessarily, or maybe there are better strategies. I know Rob and I have talked a little back and forth of like, new channels versus like, solidifying channels. Maybe it's just best practices with threading. But again, it's hard when you have all these different people who use Slack in different ways and have different preferences. I think I was mentioning once, Pat Kahn mentioned he uses Slack in a web browser, and that was just like, I don't know why, but it sort of blew my mind. um, and then in terms of workflow, I think it's, as a PM, I see the work flowing. It's hard for me to tell what like the most pressing issue is, and if people are working on the issue or not. And so most of it is just me trusting the developer team to make those decisions. So not saying I want to be the person prioritizing the issues, but I don't always have visibility or even maybe the insight to understand like this ticket is the most important, and it's great that, Kevin is working on that or something. And so maybe that is actually something we can sort of discuss more now that we're using the waffle board in the weekly meetings, which I think is something I like doing. I think it's helpful, at least for me. Hopefully the rest of the team, if anyone has comments on that, I'd be definitely open to hearing that. And then we can sort of talk more about priorities too, particularly as, Dan Dodson gets onboarded in January, prioritizing, making sure, there's so much work, right? That just prioritizing to making sure that, he's being used efficiently is good. And then also a concern I have too with the workflow is, we're like, now that like, hopefully, the page freezer issue is sort of not pressing anymore. And we're moving quickly to getting off Versionista. There won't be so much of like a, like the platform is burning sort of emergency. And then we can sort of decide like, because I also worry about technical debt that we've acquired over the last year, and making sure that, we reduce that and the risks to the project in terms of, technical debt and solidifying the code base and things like that. I worry about like the fact that the DB is in Ruby and it works and it's fine, but that is like technical debt that we collected. And, we know the reasons why we are where we are, but, how do we plan to sort of start paying off some of that debt in the future, particularly if we have Dan working in the next year. And if later come April, we're fortunate to get some, resources to pay for paid developers, how would you use that too? So definitely now that like, I think I'm a little less concerned about the emergencies that we were dealing with that seem to I think we're moving to getting resolved, thinking to the future is something that I also want to sort of bring the attention to when we're thinking about workflow. Does that answer your question totally, or?
Yeah, that was helpful to hear. Any reactions to any of that, or? So Kevin, that's a thumbs up.
I was just gonna say, it all sounds like it all aligns with like my thinking. It sounds good, like what you've laid out. Sounds good to me.
Right. And another thing too in the future too that we might not be quite ready for, or we've said we are ready for, is also recruiting new developers. And I've only started reaching out to more senior people that we know, like some Code for America people based in New York that actually Rob knows. We didn't want to I don't want to go to like some Python meetups and start pitching this and then have, 5 people with some experience but needed some handholding, where we don't really have the capacity to do that while we're trying to meet these immediate deadlines still, stuff like that. So that's something to think about in the future too, which was an original, I think, part of the role, which I'm happy to do as long as we're ready to like absorb that people, Toli and I briefly mentioned too, would be great too if there was, there's someone, paid on the project, a developer paid on the project too, some of their responsibility could be, onboarding and mentoring where people on a more consistent basis, just to make sure if someone shows up, they're just not sort of like get lost in the shuffle or something. because it's tough when you devote resources and time to someone and then they disappear in 2 weeks, because there's an opportunity cost of that.
Yeah, so I'd love to talk about that, but I guess well, maybe before we get to that, you mentioned that you might not have, you're saying you don't always have the best visibility of understanding what to prioritize, and you're kind of trusting, I guess, yeah, Rod and Kevin on some of these points. So I'm wondering, I mean, is that an issue of, like, you're just still trying to understand the full project and what to kind of what's next, or is it because I would expect sort of the project manager to have a good sense of the prioritization, and what should we do to improve that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think we all know what the goal is, and that's clearly defined. Like, like it's the version 0.1 to get off, get the analysts into the UI, and then eventually turn off Versionista. So I think that's clear to everyone, and we're making progress towards that. And so maybe that's enough, or maybe in the in the meetings there is that line item of like the milestone updates, and maybe that's more, maybe we can devote more time to that like line item to really discuss like how close are we, because there's always good and there's good enough, and we just want to make sure we're aiming for good enough so that the analysts can do their work and we can get off some of these paid services. But I'm definitely open to I don't know, what do Rob, Kevin, and Dan think about this?
Maybe the aspect of this that is probably the hardest to put on you, Ray, is sort of the picture of what depends on what, or what is good enough and we should move on. Like, I think you're saying that you totally understand the scope of milestone 1, milestone 2, milestone 3,
right?
But like, how far does the differ need to get before we put that down and work on something else? Is it too soon to start thinking about something that we know we only need for 3, but we have the capacity to work on it? Like, maybe that stuff.
Yeah, and it's not really actually a huge concern, because I do trust the team, and so it's more, I guess, me trying to find ways to help you hit the milestone. Sometimes it's easy to get hung up on something where maybe it isn't actually that important or something, or there might be something more pressing. It's really just me trying to figure out ways to help to make sure we make those milestones. And so maybe there's nothing to do. Maybe it's working and we're making progress, which we feel like we are. So I don't want to overstate sort of the concern. Some of it too is, I am in GitHub a little bit, and sort of a little bit more like this month than previous months, just writing a few tests and things like that, getting myself a little more familiar with the way the 3 repos are set up. Obviously, I wasn't hired as a programmer, so I don't know if that's like a useful. I guess would it be also interesting for me here is like, were you expecting me to be doing more of that, or are you sometimes wondering like, why is he fiddling in the repo, or maybe it's I shouldn't be fiddling with tests, but maybe I should just be trying to write more documentation or something. The software development part has probably been a little lighter than I originally, I think, thought, in involvement in some of those kinds of tasks. Not as necessarily programming, but just working more directly with some of the developer tasks. Some of it, I think, was just being diverted into some of this budget funding kinds of things, which I'm happy to work on, because maybe my time is better spent like making sure there's money to keep the lights on. I don't know. I'd be also curious for Rob's perspective on that question. Not to put you on the spot.
I'd like you to be telling us what to do more.
Okay.
I think in line with that point from Tully and from Dan, I don't think we're doing a great job managing, knowing when we're done enough and getting things coordinated and continually moving forward. At least from my perspective, I feel like I'm still flailing around doing 10 different things all the time.
Uh-huh.
And so I don't feel like we solved that problem.
Okay. Do you think done enough is then more of an issue of QA? Like, sort of like, this is being merged, we should look at this, and then we should move on to the next thing? Or is it...
I mean, there's an issue of QA in that, like, obviously you shouldn't merge something that is broken or
Sure.
takes us backwards.
Right.
But there's also an issue of managing that work and saying, don't put more in here. Find a way to cut it off here so that we can push it out and get people using it.
Right.
And figure out when the more work that you want to do to polish it up more or whatever, figure out how to schedule that in, but know when to say, you don't need to do that now.
Right.
Like it's functional and we have a house burning issue. So functional is more important than like looks nice, or it's not. I don't know.
Right.
Like when and for what things does that matter, right? Like I need somebody to take the search thing and tell me, no, it's too much of a fucking piece of shit. We can't do that. Or
Right.
to say, this is a really good solve, even though it's poor. And now we need to merge it and schedule in another task to like clean it up or figure out how we need to make it right or whatever.
Right.
I think it's as much or more that than QA, right? Like from the QA perspective, yes, we need to always be doing it, and yes, everything should take us forward, not backwards, and yes, we should not
Right.
merge a broken thing. But it's more about saying, don't sit here and spend the stupid amount of time that you don't have on this piece of work,
Right.
when we need to do all these other things.
Sure. Yeah, that's really helpful to hear. I think one way maybe we can work on that is also then, have like, I don't know, weekly pushes to production, because that I think might force us to say like, is this done enough? And if people don't feel like it's done enough, then we can say, maybe it is. And then just push it out. And if there's something we want to fix later, we can, write a new issue for that to fix it later, but it is maybe good enough to go into production. And so we could also, that'll also get, the analysts that we're trying to onboard to in production. And we were just making sure they're seeing the most current stuff so that, they can, it'll just keep us honest that we're not sort of just in staging, like fiddling. And then, it'll force us to say like, we're done with this for now. Does that sound reasonable? Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like one way to try to consolidate around these on a weekly basis. I guess I'm also wondering, is it a question of like it's not a tight enough feedback loop between you and the individual like contributors to the project, where like Rob was working on the search feature, and the first thing that happens after Rob is done with it is you look at it and like, critique it, or like in the middle of the process, you say like, let's go for this level of, you talk it through before Rob even gets started or something quickly and say like, okay, see if you can do something in like 2 hours because this is important, but not that important. Just as a way to like help scope these things, not to like bridle too many, the time and try to micromanage too much. But as like, I guess I imagine it as if there's a tight feedback loop, as someone did something and you check it and say, this is good enough, like you can be the first filter on that. And that might help you get a sense of these things.
Sure. Yeah, I don't know if like people necessarily need to check in with me before they start an issue, but I think it could also be more, maybe we have, you know, like, I don't know if we need daily stand-ups, but even in Slack or something, but maybe it is like before people start new work, they're like, I'm working on this today. So that just as a team too, people understand what people are working on. I don't know, would that be helpful for people to know? Or do you feel like amongst, Dan, Kevin, and Rob, that you amongst each other know what's happening with what you're working on?
I think about half the time I make an effort to say something in web monitoring when I'm picking up an issue, and it wouldn't be bad if I did that more regularly. When I know what Kevin and Rob are working on, or when I have some sense of which pieces are moving, I know what's safe to work on in parallel to that, or what might be coming up. So I think Rob has always pushed us to use the assigned to feature carefully so that people don't do something in duplicate, because that's only happened. I don't think it's happened within our core contributors yet, but it has happened with multiple flyby contributors or something.
Yeah, because they don't know. Right.
So, that's been really helpful. But then among the things that are assigned to you, it would generate a lot of noise to say in GitHub that you're picking it up and setting it down. It might be nice to do that in the web monitoring channel.
Right. Yeah, that sounds great. I think it's a really good suggestion. Does it sound
also, if anybody feels like they need to slap my wrist with respect to the search thing, please do so, because I'm surprised nobody has. That was about the worst behavior that I could have done in terms of development process.
What was that again? You were breaking up.
The giant. Wait, what was the first one? The giant diff PR?
No, the search.
Oh, yeah. That was not on my radar.
Yeah,
it was probably on nobody's radar, because I was like, I'm going to demo this stuff, and I realized that everybody keeps being like, well, we can't really figure out how to get to shit. So I was like, well, maybe if I just make it easy for somebody to type in a URL and give that to them, that'll solve that problem. But I just went and did it. I took an hour and did it and didn't tell anybody anything. And
as an aside,
I put it up there an hour, maybe or two before the demo, and that was all.
Happy birthday, Tully.
As an aside, I've been dreading not having a search, so that was amazing to see.
Right, and I knew that Tully felt like that was in some ways a deal breaker, like the analyst would need that. So it was. I mean, it's sort of maybe not a best practice, but we were all happy to see it. So we maybe shouldn't reward the behavior, but something like search, just if you have the URL, because while they're still trying to use both so they can just find something, I think is helpful. Even in Virginista, I use just the browser find, like text find, a lot. So
the Virginista search is horrifyingly bad. I don't know, it never finds things for me.
So, good point, Dan. So, we'll just close the loop. So using find for now on any Virginista or our platform, I think it's it works, right? You can find what you're looking for. That's fine. So there's a meeting at 2, but I think part of the reason was I wasn't sure if this was supposed to be recorded or not. So, which is why I didn't turn it, had 2, and it was also sort of Zoom is confusing. You can't change just one meeting or something, or I can figure out how. So we can just keep this running, if rather than try to log in and log out. If people are fine with that.
Okay. Should we split the video?
Sure. So, were there any other comments?
I just wanted to talk about the search real fast, but for me, I was fine with it because, it was very useful. But I think it goes back to that conversation of because in my mind, the issue is the search is this huge thing where it was we need to search across all the categories, all this stuff, but there was no delineation where, well, maybe we just need URL for now, so it could have been broken up better, and then that it would have been fine, more fine in that way. Because I never wanted to approach it because it just seemed like such a huge thing to just devote a lot of time to. But if it was said, oh no, we just need this small piece now, it would have been more approachable.
Yeah, I do think like outside of our process for working, we have a bunch of issues that were created in the repository by folks early on who were like, we need this sort of functionality. And we didn't sort of break them down into tasks of work. And one of the advantages we have, because we're not developing a product for public consumption, we're developing like a professional tool, basically, is like we can build small, shitty pieces of things because we are tightly related to the people using it. And if they have questions, we can answer them immediately. You know, we can demo it and talk with them about it beforehand. So, I mean, we should, outside of the process I went through to build the search, like we should be approaching I think we should be approaching all the pieces of functionality from that perspective of like, what's the small dumb thing we can do to push this piece of larger functionality we need forward, rather than try and say, I have to do all of like a magical search that lets you do faceted things and everything, you know, like just be like, all right, how can we give people the way to like find URLs if that's the most important, quick or easy thing to do that helps them.
Right. And maybe too, then when we're, now trying to sort of, going forward, I'll make a conscious effort of like, okay, what do we need to get to version 1 to say this is good enough? And, if there is something like if search is a deal breaker, we need search, we can make sure some of these issues do get maybe discussed beforehand, fleshed out a little bit to say like, with a little thinking like this is the minimal feature set for search. And then it's just there, and we can be a little more proactive to making sure that these things that we know need to happen before we release it, or we say we reach a milestone, we just flesh some of that stuff out in the issue, so that we can see what the minimal feature set is. And so if Kevin then wants to, then it's a little more approachable. So it's not just like this huge, massive 100-hour project, but it's like, oh, this is a half-day project or something.
I also was gonna say I like that. I feel like I should do that whole like in Slack channel, like, oh, I'm working on this issue today, just to update people, so everybody has a better idea. I don't do that ever. So I was like, oh, I should do that. I just wanted to put that out there. I like that idea of just like I'm working on this today, just so people know that that's what I'm doing. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. I think that would be great. Okay, so...
sorry.
No, go ahead.
The one other thing I wanted to say, totally unrelated to what we were just talking about, is the other thing I would like to see us have that I feel like we're missing that's problematic is some way of logging, coordinating, managing deployment, which could be as dumb as like a Google Doc that just lists every time somebody deployed and what commit they deployed to whichever server, because I feel like mostly it's me doing it, and I do it on a very ad hoc basis, but I don't know if other people are also deploying at various points in time. And hopefully like the processing server will spit back at you what commit is deployed when you ask for a diff, but like there's still not a sense of like, oh, hey, we did this thing and we merged it. Has anybody deployed it yet? Every so often I just come around and do it, but yeah.
Yeah, and this is for staging and production.
Yes.
Okay.
For all 4 repos.
Could the database include in the meta section of all of its responses its commit?
Yeah.
Cool. I think that might be nice for bug reporting. But I think the other issue you raised of like even something as simple as a Google Doc to sort of explain when it was deployed and perhaps why, or just a note, that would be good too. Because then you don't need to dereference the commit. You can say like deploying because we fixed the such and such, and then we know that such and such is deployed, right?
Yeah, I have to see. I have to see if there's an easy way to get that as like an environment variable out of Heroku. Otherwise, we'll have to have some sort of like build deploy process like UI does. That stuffs it into some piece of context so that we can have that info to like stuff into the response.
And if we store that in the DB, like how much of that does solve the problem you brought up, Rob? Is it?
Well, I mean, that allows you to anytime go and see what's running, and then you can compare that to master and see like whether the current state of master has been deployed. But I mean, the other side of this is some sense of saying like who has responsibility when to make sure that like when we've merged something, it gets deployed. And it also means there's no one, like, it doesn't solve the problem of there's like 4 different services and not all of them even have a web server interface to them that you could go poke it and get a response back that includes the information you're looking for.
Right.
You know, like the scraper doesn't. So there's no way to tell that other than logging into it and seeing what state it's in.
Okay, this is something I think is important because, you know, it'll, for lots of reasons. One, it'll force us to get on a good deploy schedule, and then 2, you know, just to know, you know, what we've done. It's just nice to know when we're, you know, for lots of reasons, for planning purposes, for, you know, debugging, for trying to figure out what we have. I can put that on my list to try to create a process that's reasonable. Maybe I can do some of this. Maybe there'll be some, you know, procedures to do when we're ready to deploy. You know, I'm not sure, you know, I think to start out with like a weekly deploy to production is a good goal. Even if there's just minor things, just to get in the habit of like, whatever is ready, like we push it every week. And then even if it's just like one thing, for the staging server, probably have another like offline conversation just because that cadence is probably a little different. And I'm not sure if it's just scheduled because sometimes you just want to do it, but how I capture that or help try to capture that is something I'm not 100% clear on yet.
Okay.
Cool. Totally. Do you want to turn this off and start the next one?